Now, it is a morning of Brexit on the front pages of the papers. There is the Observer. Hard Brexit stance could lose us power, say top Tories. A bunch of Conservative ministers and others there. The Sunday Times has gone with the special one, Mourinho in specially bad trouble with the tax man. But they've also got a very interesting story here about Brexit. We talk about hard and soft Brexit, and I was doing so earlier, and that really offends a lot of people. Apparently now we talk about white Brexit, black Brexit and grey Brexit. If that makes you feel any better. It doesn't make me feel any better, but it might make you feel better. Sunday Telegraph there. Our guest today is Boris Johnson, and there's a plot, apparently, to sabotage his plans for Brexit. That's wicked European diplomats leaking against him. And finally, a hilarious story here on the Mail on Sunday. Panic in number 10 over cabinet Brexit leaks. And how do we know that? Because the panicked memo talking about leaks has itself been leaked in great detail. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's start, I think, with you and Anushka. With that story, in fact.
Yes.
Yes, sorry.
It is.
So there is the memo itself. And
it is a sublime leak. This is a very angry letter from the Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Haywood, saying...
And he really is angry, isn't he?
He really is angry because the government wants no running commentary. The problem is that things keep coming out and newspapers are giving a running commentary. And he says, leaking is corrosive and undermines trust in good government. The Prime Minister has directed that we urgently tighten security processes, and anyone found to have leaked sensitive information will be dismissed, even where there is no compromise of national security. So they're really trying to clamp down. And there's another little leak in here I just have to mention. Don't call him Boris. There is another leak.
That's right. It's fascinating, this. We're not allowed to call Boris Johnson Boris because it undermines his authority as Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, that's what they've said to ministers. They need to banish his cabinet clown reputation. Apparently jokes even by the Prime Minister have, undermined him and made his job possible. But funnily enough, the Minister and Ian Duncan Smith, the former Cabinet Minister, quoted straight after this, both refer to him as Boris.
Very good. And Theresa May's so-called joke about the Foreign Secretary wasn't that funny. She's compared him to a dog that might need to be put down, which if I was him, I'd feel quite tart about.
Very unhilarious way to treat a colleague, isn't it? But they're obviously in a considerable mess. First of all, they have a huge leak inquiry about the fact that what's being leaked is that they don't know what to do, and they haven't actually got a plan. And it all sounds terribly John Major-ish, doesn't it? There's this petulant Cohen's hotline tone about it, of a government that is really so much worried about its own internal affairs and completely out of control of what's really going on.
Peter, as a columnist of forthright black and white views, how do you feel about calling it grey Brexit?
I refuse to use the word, which, as I say, always makes me think of a rather nasty laxative breakfast cereal. But and adding grey to it doesn't make it any better. Here is the introduction of the term in the Sunday Times this morning. A fascinating story about all the various options which are being considered. Allegedly, the government actually believes that it could walk away from negotiations. That's the so-called black Brexit. And then there's a white Brexit, which is everything Theresa May could possibly want: free movement of capital, no free movement of people. Well, maybe. And then there's grey Brexit, which is David Davis's thing, somewhere in between. Very interesting the way that David Davis is emerging in this as the person who can get away with doing things. And this is the point is made here. He can say that we might pay a contribution to the EU and doesn't get slapped down, whereas the other supposed Brexit ministers are being slapped down all the time. And indeed, there's a story in here that Liam Fox was at one stage allegedly locked in the lavatory. Not the lavatory, I do apologise, locked in his bedroom to prevent him speaking out during a trip to India. He denies it, I have to say, ferociously.
But this is an extraordinary moment when we've got, again, this infuriating phrase, no running commentary. The Prime Minister has said, Andrew, there will be no running commentary again and again and again. But now these people seem to be licensed, and they seem to be moving towards a more complicated and a slightly softer form of Brexit, perhaps, than we expected.
Well, David Davis is a much more cunning and experienced politician than most of these people involved. You have to remember he was a Maastricht whip in prehistory and was also a very effective committee chairman. He understands the ins and outs of politics, and I would imagine that Theresa May has realised she can probably rely on him to get some sort of respectable deal more than any of the others involved.
Very interesting. Now, we mentioned the Italian referendum, Christina Lamb, and that is going to be the big story again by this evening. Renzi, the Prime Minister, who's been called the kind of Italian Blair, is in deep, deep trouble, isn't he?
Yes, he is. I mean, following on from Brexit and Trump, this is, are we seeing the rise of more global populism movements. And Renzi has called this referendum. And I was in Italy a couple of weeks ago and I was watching the adverts for it, and it's the most complicated question. It's a 54-word question. It's all to do with reducing the powers of the Senate. And again, like Cameron, you know, called a referendum that he didn't necessarily need to call.
And these days, the only real question on any referendum paper is, are you really, really hacked off? And if the answer is yes, then the elites lose, and they look like they're going to lose in Italy.
Exactly, and you've got this former comedian, Beppe Grillo, going around mobilising people, and it's yet more sort of anti-establishment feeling. So you have that today in Italy.
Sorry, can I just press you one more time on this? Because the reason this is not entirely funny is the Italian banking system is on the edge of collapsing, and the Italian banks are owned by ordinary Italians. And if that happens, then Italy will be in a real state of maelstrom and revolt.
Absolutely. I mean, if he loses the referendum, he said he will step down, and then there will be a huge amount of instability, and people are extremely worried, as you say, about the Italian banking system. So.
And we've also got Austria as well coming up, the Austrian presidential election. And Norbert Hofer leads a party which was founded by Nazis.
Exactly, and which not that long ago was praising Hitler's Labour policies. So people are very worried about that. This is a rerun of the elections that were held in June, and he lost then by, I think, about 30,000 votes. So at the moment, the polls are looking very close. But, you know, each time we keep seeing these elections and the unwanted or unexpected thing happens.
Anushka, I mentioned the Boris Johnson story on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that. This is the story we saw developing over the week of Boris Johnson allegedly saying that he was in favour of free movement at private meetings of diplomats. And this appears to be a smear.
Well, that's what he thinks. Let's call him Foreign Secretary Johnson from now on, along the lines with the memo. But essentially, 4 ambassadors speaking anonymously suggested that he had made an argument in favour of free movement. He reacted very angrily to that. And what the Sunday Telegraph has here is a couple of people who were present there essentially saying, no, 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 he didn't say anything controversial. He made his normal argument. Now, that argument, he says, and has said since, is to say he's in favour of immigration, but he does believe there needs to be controls. And I suppose the argument is that in line with him saying he's personally in favour of free movement, which is what the ambassadors have said?
Yes, free movement means no control, so that is different, I guess. And we'll be talking to him about that, I'm sure, very shortly, but also about Syria. Christina, you've got another story, because that's the other awful thing going on in front of our TV screens at the moment.
Well, I thought it would be only fair if I mentioned Christina's story, because it's...
I see.
Probably she's too modest to mention herself. Describing the misery of Aleppo, which is considerable in eastern Aleppo. But to me, the extraordinary thing about this is the attitude we have towards it, is that we still take a something must be done view of Aleppo, when in fact what's happening is that the very, very nasty al-Nusra Front, the kind of people who a few years ago we were denouncing as al-Qaeda and regarding as hopelessly impossible Islamists, are being defeated. And that city is finally going to come to the point where there will at least be peace. The only mercy in war is a swift victory, and there hasn't been a swift victory. But after nearly seven years of war in Syria, it looks as if we might be reaching the point where Saudi Arabia and us and the French and the Americans are going to give up trying to overthrow a government, and people can at last begin to rebuild the country.
And do you think there is a realpolitik case for saying that it's been a hideous war, the Russians and Assad have behaved hideously, but actually it's better for this thing to finish?
They haven't behaved any more hideously than we or our allies have behaved in Fallujah or now in Mosul.
Come on, they have behaved. I mean, you've got people trapped in eastern Aleppo as we sit here, 300,000 people there that are being bombed every day. They've bombed the hospitals, now they've bombed the schools.
Well, our sources for this are people inside eastern Aleppo. There hasn't, as far as I know, been a single independent Western journalist in eastern Aleppo. We rely entirely on propaganda sources, on pictures which always show wounded children being carried by noble unarmed men in heaps of rubble, and we rely on this and we take it as read. You never see any of this kind of reporting from Mosul or from Fallujah, where similar things have happened, which have been done by our side. Yeah. And this blackening of the Russians just seems to me to be particularly ridiculous. Well, the thing is nearly over. We should be pleased at least that they can start rebuilding.
I was in Syria a few weeks ago and I saw Assad, and he's very confident because he has created a situation where it is looking like a choice between him and
If I had Putin
rebels.
at my shoulder, I'd be very confident too.
Yeah,
we're going to talk a lot more about
situation.
this with Boris Johnson later on. So can I move back to some domestic politics? And I think you had the story about Paul Nuttall's CV.
Oh yeah, this is a very funny story. So Paul Nuttall, the new leader of UKIP, who you have coming on, first of all put on his CV that he was a professional player for Tranmere Rovers, which he wasn't, so he had to remove that. Now he's been caught out saying that he's got a doctorate in history from Liverpool Hope University. Well, actually, there was no Liverpool Hope University at the date when he says that he got a doctorate. So.
And he says it was an over-enthusiastic researcher, Peter Hitchens.
That's always it, isn't it? Over-enthusiastic researchers or press officers have put these things out, which is, of course, no doubt the case.
Finally, Asthana, you've got a story about the great women of Fleet Street. But before we come to that, I just want to ask you about the Richmond by-election, because this was an extraordinary by-election, in a sense, for the Labour Party, where they got fewer votes than they have members in the constituency. The worst performance, I think, since 1909 in London for Labour. To what extent do you think this is going to provoke a kind of rethinking and this talk about a realignment of the progressive, so-called, or the anti-Brexit forces in British politics?
Well, there were a number of people in the Labour Party who were calling for the party not to put up anyone against the Lib Dems in Richmond. They want to form this progressive alliance, but I spoke to some of the MPs who made those calls and they got a really hard time from colleagues in the Labour Party who want nothing
don't want to deal with the Lib
Dems.
With
it. And to some extent you can say there are voters who would say, actually, we don't like the Lib Dems any more than the Conservatives. But what happened in Richmond was that they went back to a tactic they've used before. They massively squeezed the Labour vote and they managed to win, which is a warning both to the Tories, because Tory Remainers were peeled away, but also to Labour, because they're worrying a lot about UKIP, but they've got a very, very large number of voters on the other end of their
have to look in two directions at once. That is sadly all we've got time for. Thank you all very much indeed.